Sure. So thank you, Barbara. I want to welcome everybody to All Points West Distillery. We're named after the old Jersey Central Railroad that used to connect the ports on the Hudson to All Points West, and I kind of did that to remind myself that I was going to always be focused in developing spirits that really looked at the history of immigrant contributions to the United States and really see how spirits developed historically and how they changed and how I could kind of mine those changes. But as we've been in COVID, I've come a little bit morbidly fascinated with the end of distilleries, when certain distilleries closed down, why the products that they made stopped being made. And to a certain extent, my products really represent the endpoints of certain processes. And I'll just briefly kind of go through them. But the first one actually would be a local distillery. The first distillery in North America was right on the Newark Bay. It was in Staten Island, somewhere between Richmond Terrace along the Kilvan Cull, so very, very close to Newark. And that distillery was making Dutch-style gins back in the 17th century. And they had a very short history, but I think a kind of a brilliant one and one that maybe impacted Newark. And I'm going to tell you about it, and then we're going to make a cocktail with my gin. So they were celebrating the opening of their first big commercial distillery, and they invited the local indigenous tribe that was around this region, the Lenni Lenape tribe, over. They came out to Staten Island, and they overindulged a little bit. So in the morning, the Lenape back in New Jersey, or what was then Pavonia, started to argue. They couldn't really decide whether the Dutch had meant to embarrass them or kill them. But at the end, they said that it wouldn't matter. They were going to go back to Staten Island and burn everything down, including the distillery. And they did, and it resulted in about 20 years of hostility between the Dutch and the Lenape until the British took over. And the first thing the Lenape did was sold the land that Newark's on to the British, so they would have somebody other than the Dutch in their backyard. So to a certain extent, Newark owes its existence to bad Dutch-style gin, and maybe now my first spirit is hopefully a good Dutch-style gin. So I'm going to be making a cocktail called a Fitzgerald. It's a very simple sour. So when I talk about sours, I'm talking about cocktails that mix citrus, sweet, and spirit. So there are typically 3 cocktails, maybe with some added bitter, maybe with some added botanicals, and this is one of the simplest. So I'm going to be using Cat House gin, which is the gin that we make here, lemon juice, and simple syrup, and a little bit of Angostura bitters. And I love Angostura bitters because they're something that shouldn't exist anymore. They're an 18th century aromatic bitter that managed to survive everything. They survived the end of colonialism, they survived Prohibition, and they are still making it in Trinidad the way they've been making it for 200 years. It shouldn't exist, and I'm very happy that it still does. So I'm going to make this cocktail for you. All the cocktails that we make and all sours, they tend to be shaken because you really want to be able to work the citrus and the sugar and the spirit into suspension. If you tend to mix spirits together, you would stir, but when you're mixing fruit juices, you tend to shake. So I'm going to use a pint glass and a shaker tin. And this is a cocktail jigger, a Bell-style jigger, which is very appropriate for the cocktail because this is the type of jigger that would have been popular pre-Prohibition. And I'm not sure if you distributed, but I made a small PDF of 7 simple sours that people could make at home. So you can email me for it if it wasn't distributed as part of the invite. So we're going to do a 1.5 ounces of gin. Three-quarters of an ounce of lemon juice. Three-quarters of an ounce of simple syrup. 2 dashes of Angostura bitters. and half an ounce of egg whites. I think egg whites are a really great ingredient in cocktails. They tend to give it a nice kind of silky viscosity, and they also can create a foam. We're going to be making a whiskey sour later, where we'll use more egg white, and we're actually going to use that foam to hold oils from an orange rind. Get some ice for the tin. We'll use a Hawthorne strainer and strain into a 5.5 ounce coupe. This drink has a very kind of delicate pinkish color that it gets from the Angostura bitters. It has a very nice little layer of foam on top, and the taste is going to be very bright from the citrus, and behind that brightness you'll get all of the spices, both the Caribbean spices in the Angostura and the continental spices from the gin, and I think they balance very well together. Cheers. So, the second spirit I want to discuss is the All Points West Malt and Grain Pot Still Whiskey. But before that, let me show you how we make it. So we're not only just a tasting room, we also are a full production facility. And we start with grain. We bring in a variety of grains. Here I have organic corn from the Finger Lakes region of New York, and I have some German malts. We also use a lot of Irish malts. We bring in the grain, in sacks. We really aren't large enough to have a silo, and we mill the grain on site. So we have a small 3-roller mill. It's kind of a brewery-style mill, and that's going to crack the grain into 3 or 4 pieces. It won't actually reduce it into a flour, and that's important because we are using a kind of archaic technique. It's the technique that's used by brewers. It's called lautering, where you actually use the husk of the grain in order to separate the sugars that you produce from the solids of the grain. And we do that in this vessel, which is called a lauter tun. And this vessel has a false bottom that holds up the grain bed. And we heat up the grain, and there's some malted grain in there, and I won't go into the details of the process, but what happens is the starches in the grain get converted into sugar, and we're able to wash that sugar away, and we get a glucose solution that we can then ferment. So we take that glucose solution, we pitch our yeast, and that yeast will turn the glucose into ethanol, and we can later concentrate that ethanol to make the whiskey, which we do in the stills that are behind me. And we put that whiskey into barrels and let them sit right now for 20 months. Now, the type of whiskey that I'm making is really a lost style. It's something that almost disappeared and thankfully survived, but the exact type that I'm doing is something that's gone. So it's called pot still whiskey, and pot still whiskey is a type of Irish whiskey that they developed to avoid taxes. Back when Ireland was part of the UK, the British wanted to tax whiskey, but they didn't think it was wise to tax the whiskey directly, so they decided to tax the malts that the distillers were purchasing. So the moment they passed this malt tax, the Irish distillers started to use less malt. They started to push the technologies to move away from their traditional malt whiskeys to eventually all the whiskeys we have today. Both rye, bourbon, blended whiskeys, they all owe their heritage to this moment in Ireland when they started to experiment with unmalted grains to avoid tax. And in the early part of the 20th century, all Irish distilleries except for 2 closed, and all Irish pot still whiskey brands except for 2 disappeared from the market. Now they're having a resurgence, and I'm kind of glad to be part of that resurgence. But I'm making a very particular version of pot still whiskey, one that died even before the mid-19th century, one that died in 1908. We know the exact date because it was the exact date that this style of whiskey was made illegal. This is an Irish pot still style whiskey that has corn as the unmalted component of the grain bill. This is something that the Irish started doing during the potato famine, and they continued to do this for 60 years until the Royal Commission on the Standards of Whiskies made it illegal, and they made it illegal specifically because it was too American in flavor profile. They did not want a whiskey that had any corn character because they thought it would corrupt the palate of the UK consumer and open up the market to American bourbons. And that resulted in the closure of the largest pot still distillery in the world. It was a distillery in Scotland called the Caledonian Distillery, and they were making Irish-style pot still whiskey in Scotland with corn. And the moment this law was passed, they dismantled their stills and closed their doors, never to reopen. And I'm making this whiskey for the first time in 110 years. And I'm proud to say that last year we won Whiskey of the Year at the USA Spirits Weight Rating. So it's been well received internationally. So we're going to make a whiskey sour. Going to make an 1.5 ounces of the All Points West Malton Grain whiskey. An 1.5 ounces of lemon juice. So we're going to use more lemon as well as more egg white to make a much foamier cocktail. Three-quarter ounces of simple syrup. And 3/4 ounces of egg whites. And what's going to happen when I shake this cocktail is that it'll build a very dense foam. And that foam is going to allow me to create a neutral layer to hold one of the most amazing aromas, and that is of orange. So there's 2 things that you get from citrus. One is the juice, which you get from the flesh of the fruit, and the other is the oils that you get from the rind of the fruit. And the oils are extracted by a number of ways. Traditionally, the British would make punches, and they would take lemon rind and muddle that lemon rind with sugar and use the sugar to extract the oils from the rind. And this is something called oleo succorum, or oily sugar. And that was the basis of all British punches. And as people moved on to cocktails from punch, they found shortcuts to get those oils. And this is a very simple shortcut. We use a peeler, one designed specifically for cocktails. It makes a very thin peel that doesn't have any pith. So you see it's orange on both sides. We take the outside of the orange, point it to the drink, and I'm going to squeeze it, and that'll actually express the oils, and the foam will actually capture the oil, and then you're going to get the aroma of the orange oils when you're drinking the drink. Cheers. It's a very simple cocktail, and I think it's one of the nicest. It's also a cocktail that I think deserves different types of whiskey, because everything that you're putting in there is so, in a sense, plain. The whiskey and the different whiskeys that you use will radically change the cocktail, and it's really worth exploring with a variety of different whiskeys. I want to introduce my my newest product, my Gil Spaier pot still rum. So there was two places where rum kind of originates, at least in the Western Hemisphere. It's in the Caribbean and in Brazil. And those two worlds collided due to two things. The Dutch losing their possessions in Brazil, and also the Dutch losing their possessions in the Caribbean and in North America. And suddenly you had a bunch of Dutch traders who could access British colonies to source materials. And they did that, and they made the first rum distillery, the first commercial rum distillery in the world, which actually isn't in the Caribbean, but was also in Staten Island. It was right off Gil Spaier. It was founded in 1664, 2 years before the founding of Newark, and they were importing molasses from the British East Indies, and they were making rum, you know, right here on Newark Bay. And this rum would have been very different from the rum we know today. They wouldn't have had industrial column stills, and the molasses would not be as refined. It would have had a lot more residual sugars in it, and it was something that would have spontaneously fermented. So it would have been a lot funkier than today's molasses rum. And we've been working very hard, actually been working for 3 years to try to source sugars and develop yeast and bacterial fermentation that we think would be a possible way that that rum would have tasted. We have no samples, nothing is preserved. But that distillery probably closed in the late 17th century. We don't have the closing date, we only have the founding date. And this is my rum, and we're going to make a classic rum drink. We're going to make a mojito. So mojito mixes two of the techniques that that we had. We want to get both juice and oil from the citrus. And in this case, the citrus is going to be lime. And the lime has to be prepared very carefully. So there's bitter elements in the lime. It's the pith. And you need to avoid the pith. The pith is held behind the skin on the outside of the lime, but in the center of the lime, it's exposed. And if you don't remove it, you're going to end up getting a very bitter cocktail. So I'm going to remove the center pith of the lime, put it into a glass, and now I'm going to be doing two things at once. I'm going to be using a high granule sugar and a muddler, both to juice the lime and to extract the oils from the rind. And this is an amazing cocktail that exists in two variations. In the Caribbean, it's the Mojito, and in Brazil, it is the Caipirinha. Both use the same technique. The difference between the two is that the Mojito also introduces lime. So I'm using the muddler, and that sugar is going to be pushing into the rind and actually dissolving and extracting oils. It's very, very different if you try to make this drink with squeezed lime juice versus actually muddling it. It is a far less complex and far less compelling beverage. Going to add some mint leaves. Muddle them as well. Can already smell the oils coming out. Put 2 ounces of rum. And for this drink, We won't be straining the ice, so we'll be pouring it with the ice. Top it with soda. Take lime and do something that most people think is kind of bizarre when they see it for the first time, but we're actually, sorry, mint. We're going to bruise the mint, and the plant is actually still alive. The cells there are still, metabolizing, and when they get injured, they're going to try to fix themselves, and they're going to start to release antioxidants, and at the same time, they're also going to release all of these oils and aromas, and so it actually becomes much mintier the moment you bruise it. And you convince this mint to actually start trying to save itself before we consume it. Cheers, a classic mojito. So there we have 3 nearly identical techniques and 3 very different tasting and different appearing cocktails. All from, one set of tools, and I hope that you make some cocktails at home and enjoy it. And I hope that you, when times are good, come and visit the distillery. We give an extensive tour, and we have over 30 cocktails on our menu right now. And everybody, good health, and back to you, Barbara.